Well, we want to welcome everybody tonight to our program. This is a get together of a lot of us Northwestern folks that have used to get together quite a bit. They used to have a festival down in Powell's Wood, their botanical gardens. They used to have a festival over in the Forest Festival over in Port Angeles. We used to get together a lot of times just sharing storytellers back and forth. People would come down and join us, or they would we would go visit them. But after Zoom, we kind of got out of touch with each other, and I just thought it'd be great to have a program in which each one of our Northwest guilds would be represented. Now, I'm not going to tell a story because I don't want to make the program too long, but I certainly am going to introduce our other tellers as we go. And we've got a variety of tellers from different guilds in the area. They're going to share a little bit about what their guild's up to. And I also have a document that I'm finalizing that'll give information about each one of the guilds, including contact information and programs and their website addresses and other things, which I will send out a link to everybody that comes tonight, so that you can get in touch with each other even more. And I hope that probably this will be the beginning of more interaction, even though some of us have gone back to live programs, and you don't see a lot of people when you're live that you would see on Zoom, and some of us are still on Zoom and we don't get the opportunity to see the people live. But we do need to keep in touch, keep connected. Unfortunately, we don't have our epic programs anymore, which we shared storytellers from all over at, but we do have one thing coming up, and that's the National Storytelling Network Conference, which will be July 11th and 14th, right here at Federal Way, Washington, just south of Seattle. We're going to have a couple hundred storytellers here. They've got 50 workshops, all kinds of concerts and other programs going on. And if you go to the NSN website, click on events, you'll get information about it. Registration and housing will start on the 31st of January at 11 a.m. Central Standard Time. So if you go to the website, and I'll send you this information too afterwards, but you can see how you can get involved. There's going to be an opportunity for some access virtually. I think for $75 you can get to some of the concerts and stuff, but the whole thing is not going to be recorded. But it'll be a great opportunity for you to connect with other storytellers if you can come. And even if you just get into some of it, it'd be great. But right now we need to get started on our program. We have tellers from a number of our different guilds out in the area. We're still waiting for one of our tellers to show up.
He's here. I let him in. Yeah.
Oh, good. I'm glad he's here. Anyway, I'm going to ask first for, is he ready to go? I had him first on the list.
No, I let him in. I don't know where he is.
If you're talking about Stet Palmer, which shows Linda K. Palmer, which is my beautiful wife, and somehow I'm afraid to touch anything on this screen to change the name. So if you're talking about me, Mary,
Linda, huh?
Yep, there you go. So was I first up on the list, Barry?
Yeah, as soon as I can find you.
Okay, I'm just to your left on the screen.
Oh yeah, but I'm looking at the wrong view here. So okay, let's see. There you are. Okay. Let me spotlight you here real quick, and then I will introduce you, and then you can go to it. Steph Palmer enjoys history and believes there's a wealth of stories to be found in the lives of our Pacific Northwest people. He was a contender for the Apollo 13 space mission and has many interesting stories related to his time as an Air Force and commercial pilot. Unfortunately, he didn't get into the movie either, I guess. But anyway, Seth has been a member of the South Sound Story Guild, which is down in the Olympia area, for several years, and he's shared tales with local historical figures in the area. His story tonight is an aviation story called The Shepherd. And he maybe mentioned a little bit about what South Sound is up to. We're asking each of our tellers to take about 10 minutes for their story and to share something about their guild. So go to it, Seth.
Okay, thanks, Barry. Thanks for your consideration and everything. And I've got to tell you, first of all, tell a little bit about the South Sound Story Guild. We tell tall tales, short tales, long tales, and every kind of tale. And I have a short bio. I'm actually quite interested in reading obituaries because they tell us a lot about people's different lives. So I think Maggie or Toby said, you know what, we need to flesh out your bio a little bit. So there must have been something exciting when you're flying. And with too much of a straight face, I said, well, you know, I was in the Apollo 13 program. And she didn't put two and two together and figure I'm not that old and I'm not that good. So somehow it's stretched in there. So if there's anybody around here checking on facts, I was not in the Apollo 13 program, but we do tell a lot of tall tales. And I'll talk about the South Sound Story Guild a little bit. Barry highlighted it a lot. We are down in Olympia. We tell stories every second Wednesday, 6 to 8 p.m. We have an opening teller and then a featured teller. Often some of you from other guilds are a featured teller. And the second hour is entirely an open story swap. And our guild prides itself on welcoming all tellers and all listeners. There's no audition or anything. We have people walk through the door that have one story in their life. They tell it and we never see them again. And we have other people just keep showing up and applauding for all of the stories, and we welcome them also. So we have several events other than our monthly story swap. We have a Fanning the Embers retreat up on Hood Canal, and a few of you have been to that. We have about 20-some people in the fall, in the spring rather, and it is a great time just to get together, tell stories, and be together and friends, and actually eat food together, which is important. Let's see, what else do we do? Well, we've got Stories in the Park and Stories in the Dark in August at Squaxin Park in Olympia. The first hour are general stories, and then it gets dark, and then we tell the spooky, scary stories. And that's a lot of fun. So we really invite you to go to our website, southsoundstory.org, and look us up and read about our members. We've got some really professional members there. I'll just mention a few of them that you might know. Ingrid Nixon, Rebecca Holm, Toby Ishii Anderson, Elizabeth Lord, who is Story Oli in Olympia, Maggie Lott from down south, who tells a lot of great Jack and Jill stories, Sandra Neiman, who is a retired professor of storytelling, and then we've got Billy Massey and Randy Moe, who are home run hitters all the time, and Mitch Nelson, who's actually a stand-up comedian now and storyteller who drives all the way from Riverton, Wyoming for our meetings. So we've got quite an array of folks. So that's our Story Guild. We're proud of it, and we hope that you'll all join us either in person or by Zoom on a hybrid. We get about 15 people in the building for storytelling and about 15 on Zoom. So with that, I still got about 7 minutes, so I better get into a story. And I've told Barry, if we get to 10 minutes, just cut me off, and then we'll leave that story. Like all stories should leave people wondering, well, what's going to happen next? So hopefully we'll get through that. So this is a story called The Shepherd. Now, as Barry mentioned, I flew in the Air Force as a pilot. I was a C-130 pilot for most of my 20 years. C-130 cargo plane is a large plane with a crew of 5. And then I flew for a major airline for the rest of my working life. Now, people have occasionally asked me, were you ever afraid of dying? Well, of course I wasn't, because we were highly trained, right? And we were very good. But of course, there were a lot of flights I was on where we had a certain amount of pucker factor, where various parts of the anatomy got kind of tight in certain situations. Now, one of those times was in 1972. I was a newly qualified aircraft commander with all of 1,000 flying hours, which is, when you think about it, not many at all. But the Air Force said I was qualified to take the C-130 aircraft and a crew anywhere in the world at any time and just about any kind of weather conditions, which is kind of scary when you think back on it. Now, this particular mission, my crew had stopped. We'd stopped in Azores and taken on fuel because we were going to fly on to Mildenhall, RAF Mildenhall Air Base in England. Now, I'd been in RAF Mildenhall before, and I knew the weather in England was up and down a lot. So when we were in the Azores, I said, put on more fuel than is called for in the specification. And I want a lot of fuel when I arrive in England. So we took off and we get to England, and the weather as we got there, started getting worse and worse and worse. And pretty soon the airfield's below minimums. And the command post says, well, the weather's going to improve. Start your descent from cruise altitude. And I'm thinking, no way am I going to do that, or we might die. So we went into a holding pattern, and they kept saying, okay, it's improving, come on in. And I kept refusing to do so. And finally, I diverted to another air base, which didn't have very good weather at all, but we had a good navigator, and he watched the approach on radar, and we broke out of the weather, and we safely landed. And my pucker factor released, and I'll bet the rest of the 4 crew members who were along with me for the ride felt a little bit relieved too. So we had one heck of a celebration that night. Well, the next day, I flew on to Mildenhall Air Base, and I had to give a very detailed report to my squadron commander on why I had deviated from specific instructions from the command post. Well, we had a RAF exchange officer, Felix McGuire, flight commander Felix McGuire there, who was part of our squadron, and he took me aside after the squadron commander had a rather long discussion with me and told me about a time when he had had a weather problem and had escaped with his life. It was, Felix said it was just about 10 years after the big war, and he was based at Chile Air Base in northern Germany and flying Vampire jet aircraft. And he had just gotten finally qualified to fly during nighttime operations. And he had a girlfriend back in England. So he badgered the operations officer into letting him take a Vampire scheduled for maintenance back to England. So one dark and stormy night, he took off from Chile Air Base for England, and out over the middle of the English Channel, he called up Biggin, the Royal Air Force controllers at Biggin Hill to get guidance onto his base. But when he called, nobody answered back. So he thought, I must have the wrong frequency. So flipping through his charts, he looked, called other frequencies, no dice. And he finally realized his radios were dead. There was no way he could contact anybody. Well, this is kind of a tight situation, but he still had flight instruments, and he knew he could descend in the weather and fly an instrument approach. But when he tuned in the radio beacons, none of those were working either. So what do? Well, first you reset all the circuit breakers on your side panel, and then you get out your little flashlight and you kind of rap on all the receivers to see if those methods will fix the problem. It did not fix the problem. So Felix realized he was up there with no radio, no navigational aids, and the weather down below was getting rather bad. So he set up what's called a triangular pattern, flying around and hoping that the radar controllers on the ground would realize that he's up there without a radio, and if there's a plane in the area, they'll have them rendezvous so they can fly formation down to a safe landing. Well, fuel was getting to be a little bit tight, and he realized that he had about 5 more minutes, and then he was going to have to turn back and fly out over the channel, eject from the airplane, hope the airplane went into the channel, and he landed on safe ground. About that time, Felix said he happened to look out, and here came an airplane below him, slowly coming up and joining on him. And when he looked at it, he was surprised. This was a Mosquito aircraft, which was a World War II high-speed airplane that was used a lot for intelligence and reconnaissance. And Felix had never seen one before, actually, but being a good pilot, he knew how to get in and rejoin on another airplane, keeping the wingtips lined with the cockpit and everything, so he had good visual reference. And the Mosquito pilot tapped on his helmet saying, I'm number 1, and Felix acknowledged that he understood he was to fly the wing. And they started to descend on down. Felix said at about 3,000 feet, they entered the weather, and now it was really tight, but he's hanging on the wing there really well because he knows this is the only way he's going to get in. And as he gets on down, finally they lower the flaps, they lower the gear, and they start their descent. And at about 500 feet, he starts to see some lights break out. He lands. It's an old runway. As he taxis in, he realizes there's weeds growing along the runway, and he sees somebody with a lantern off the side waving him in. He goes in, and he shuts down the plane, gets out on very weak legs, and he realizes It's the oldest flight lieutenant he's ever seen who's guiding him in. The flight lieutenant says, "We're just a logistics base now, but we turned on the lights because we heard there was a plane and a problem. So welcome and go in and get some sleep. We'll call your base and have them come get you tomorrow." So the next day, Felix steps outside. It's a clear, beautiful day. He looks around. He realizes this is absolutely a derelict base. The tower is an empty shell. There are no other aircraft. There are no vehicles. There are no people. There's no flight lieutenant either. And shortly thereafter, his squadron commander shows up and goes, "We thought you were lost over the channel, but we got a call from somebody in the middle of the night saying you're here at RAF Denton, which is an abandoned airfield from World War II. So Felix relayed the story to him, and the squadron commander said, "Well, the last Mosquito aircraft were decommissioned a year ago, and DE-25 was one of those World War II planes that was sent up to lead in damaged bombers that were coming back from bombing raids. And DE-25 was actually a plane that was lost over the North Sea back in World War II. So I don't know what you were following in, but that plane did not exist anymore." And with that, Felix didn't know what to do, but the squadron commander says, "You know, based on your story, I think I'm going to take you back to talk to the flight surgeon. He's going to have a very long talk with you, and then we're going to send you on a very long recuperative rest period." And with that, Felix said, "You see, I'm still flying today, and there are a lot of interesting stories in flying, so don't give up." And that's the end of my story, and I'll let you figure out if anything happened after that. So the story is actually based on one told by Frederick Forsyth called The Shepherd. Thank you.
Barry, you're muted. Barry?
Okay, I got it. Yeah, thank you, Seth, very much for that story. You know, aviation is a very important part of the Northwest. We've got Boeing out here, and here in Everett, they build the 747s and the 767s and a lot of the other planes. Down in Renton, they build them. Unfortunately, Boeing's been getting some rather bad things in the news lately, but aviation has always been an important part of the Northwest. And thank you very much for that story.
Thank you. And Boeing aircraft are good aircraft. So there you go.
Yeah. Our next teller is actually from Canada, north of Vancouver, just over the bridge, I'm told. And have the spotlight here. Abigail Fisher-Lang is a part of the North Van Tellers. Now, they've had different names through the years, but this is their current name, I'm told. And we've had a lot of interaction with them, especially in our epics and the crone tales and other things. And so she's going to share a tale for us. Let me read her little introduction first. She's a longtime teller from Vancouver, BC, who has hosted Crick Crack since 2000. That's 24 years. Though she loves the wild, exquisitely worded ancient world myths, and I've heard her tell a few, she can really tell them. She mostly tells love stories and eulogies. Excuse my cough. These days, she's mostly a life cycle celebrant. Her work is now storytelling to enhance ceremonies marking big life events. I will be sending you the link to her website later on. But for the North Van Tellers, she's telling a story called Star of Grace.
Thank you. Thank you, Barry. What a beautiful introduction. Yeah, so the North Van Tellers were over the bridge, and we're a sister of the Vancouver Tellers, and we've been together for decades since we first started the Vancouver Society of Storytelling in the 80s. We used to put on festivals and conferences, and now we're smaller groups, but I think that we are rising again. There are more people coming out. There's more people wanting to tell, and that's a great thing. We tell at the Silk Purse Gallery on the waterfront in West Van, which is a really to die for space. They love us there, and we don't pay rent. They actually give us money so we can buy our snacks and stuff like that. When we start our storytelling, we have an opening from Haiti, from Diane Walkstein's book on Haiti, which is crick, crack. So I say crick and you say crack, but you're all in your own rooms. So you just say crack and we'll imagine it's in the air. Maybe I'll say crack myself. Okay. Crick, crack. Oh, star of wonder, star of night, star with royal beauty bright, westward leading, still proceeding, guide us to thy perfect light. On the slowly turning wheel of the year, the long winter's night is the perfect time to follow a star. But which star? Where to find it? How far to go? Where I live in the Northwest, in the shadow of the mountains in North Vancouver, it is also the largest community of Iranians outside of Iran itself. We are blessed with the Iranian culture. We are blessed with the music, the poetry of Hafez and Rumi. We are blessed with the Shahnameh and the stories and the fabrics, and especially the earth-honoring festivals of Persian culture, Nowruz, Sadeh, Yalda. The story of the three magi, also called wise men, also called kings, the story of their following the star began in ancient Persia 4,000 years ago. The story begins with a very wise teacher and prophet named Zarathustra, also called Zatosh, also called Zoroaster by the Greeks. And he was a teacher who loved the spirit and loved the earth so dearly. He taught his followers how to do agriculture. He had them learn the healing powers of plants and stones. They learned medicine and geometry and geology. But above all, he taught them how to read the stars. In our evolution, our consciousness at that time meant that human beings could look up to the night sky and follow the stars and find the story hidden therein. As if you and I open a book and turn a page and read a few words in a paragraph and get a sense of the story. They could see all that had happened on the earth and they could prophesy the future. So Zarathustra read about the birth of this child centuries to come, who would become a great teacher of love. And because his sensitive soul was so burdened by what he saw around him on the earth, the darkness, the corruption, the poverty, the cruelty, the thought of a teacher of love really enthused him and inspired him. He taught that story to his followers, who taught them to his followers, and so on and so on. And all the stories of the stars went through students and teachers and wisdom carriers. 2,000 years later, when that starry story appeared in a contemporary sky, 3 of his followers recognized it. They changed their lives. They prepared to follow the star. They were all teachers in their own way and healers. There was Melchior from the Middle East, Balthazar from the Far East, Caspar from Central Africa. They left with processions of attendants and camels and horses and gifts and food. And they traveled at night to follow the star. And at some point along the way, they met one another. They were grateful for the companionship of shared journeys. They learned each other's language. They prayed together. They shared stories. And they traveled. And the travel was full of challenge. They even met evil. They persevered. They found grace. One day they found this small, holy family, the child, the mother, the father. And they bowed down and spoke the words they had heard from their teachers who came from Zarathustra so far back, and they gave their gifts. And Melchior knelt before the child and offered gold. And he said, "Holy child, this gold is offered to you for the wisdom that you will inspire in men and women. And of course, it was known then that the gold was mined from the earth to make the 12-pointed crowns that true kings and queens wore, for they could see the 12 points of view in every issue. The second King Balthazar bowed and offered his gift. He said, "O holy child, I bring you this gift of frankincense, because the sweet fragrance of its burning opens the hearts of all. I give you this gift for the love that will come from your teaching." And the third king stepped forward, he bowed, he presented his gift. "O holy child, I bring you myrrh, the sweetness of earth from my land, used in our burial rites and given to you today because you will teach that death and life are a continuum and so bring solace into people's hearts." The gifts were received. They left. They went home a different way to avoid the palace of the evil King Herod, who, out of his jealousy and rage, had already issued an edict that all boy children under the age of 2 should be slaughtered, the slaughter of the innocents. So these 3 magi, kings, wise men, traveled towards their home. They separated. They went back to their own places. And there the great challenge arose. They had to find a way to describe their experiences, where they had been, who they had met, what they had seen, what they had thought, and explain what had happened to those who were not there with them. And to me, this is a really important part of the story as storytellers. This, to me, is the storytelling festival, because we are all like that. We all have to find our way of describing in words or in music or in movement what we have experienced and share it with others. And I will just leave with a very small story. For this story, I would call one of the big stories. And we know every culture has its big stories, its creation myths, legends of heroes and heroines, stories of teachings from nature and spiritual life. And all of those big stories have thousands of little stories inside. And it is said that if all the small stories inside the big story of the 3 kings and the star, if all of those stories were laid side by side, that they would circumvent the earth. And this is my small story from the big story. And it's another North Vancouver story. It happens near my house in a park where a great tree, not far in from the road, so it can easily be seen, was covered with candles on the night of the winter solstice. And then again, for the first night of winter, the first night of Christmas, which is for the warm, simple shepherd's hearts in all of us. And for every night to the 12th night of Christmas, which is for the wise heads of kings in all of us. And every night 2 or 3 people would gather and light the candles and shield them from the wind and the rain and see the birds overhead. And people coming down the path would come and meet with them. People going to visit their neighbors or coming home with their kids or people walking their dogs. They'd all come. Who does not want to stand around a candle-lit tree on a winter's night? And then there'd be conversation and stories and the singing of Christmas carols and the sharing of thermoses and tea and cookies, and friendships were made. And almost every night for that time, almost every candle was lit for at least a while. Because those people, all of us, we willed it, that those lights would remain lit and gather others. And also, and on the night of Yalda, the Persian celebration of Yalda, the winter festival, we ate pomegranate seeds and opened the book of Hafez poetry. So there was a small festival. And the golden jewel in the heart of each flame shone like stars in the night. Oh, star of wonder, star of light, star with royal beauty bright, westward leading, still proceeding, guide us to thy perfect light.
Well, thank you
Thank-
very much, Abigail. Vancouver is a very cosmopolitan city. It has all kinds of people. And my wife and I made a trip up there many years ago and went to Queen Elizabeth's Park on a Saturday afternoon. And there were brides and grooms getting their picture taken all over the place. And they were wearing all kinds of ethnic costumes and so on. There's lots of culture in that town. And I think probably it's enriched because of all the stories that the different people bring to Vancouver.
I agree with you. It's unbelievable when you start to be with people from different cultures and you ask them, well, what is this festival about? Like, how did this come about? And then you hear the story of Zarathustra, and it is an amazing story. And no matter what you feel about it in terms of story, or you may think it's religious or not, but just this amazing journey, this challenge, and the stories are so beautifully, deeply carried to this day. Also India, because some years ago when we did the epic, we did the Mahabharata. We did all the stories from India, and we've done so many of those epics. They're so great. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank
Next,
you.
we're going to have Brad Grindrad. He says people always have fun trying to pronounce his name. Let me get me up here real quickly. Okay, there I am. Yeah, he is representing the Fireside Storytellers League of Tacoma, though they actually get together in Puyallup. One of the things that people learn when they come to the Northwest is that many of their names are hard to pronounce, and Puyallup is one of the ones that people always struggle with. But they are a small group of people that basically work based in Tacoma, but they have quite a outreach of storytelling in museums and schools and other places. And they also are going to be hosting. They hosted a very well-known storyteller this last summer. They're hosting another one this coming summer. Information will be about that, about Antonio, who's coming to the area, will be available, I assume, on their website at some point, but I'll be sending information about them. Brad is the vice president of the Fireside Storytellers League. They have, give or take, about 17 members that meet monthly and live and in person at the Puyallup City Library. Brad entered the world of storytelling through the doorway of public speaking as a longtime Toastmaster. Which is really a helpful background to have, he says, but not near as much fun as entertaining folks with a well-spun story. Brad is telling a traditional Chinese folk tale called The Student and the Monk, which has lots of fun, and it's likely to give you a chuckle at the end. Brad?
Thank you, Barry. A while back, I did an interview with a young lady for her YouTube podcast, which is a thing these days, in which we talked about storytelling and storytellers. And during the course of the interview, the conversation turned toward Bible stories, which I like to tell, particularly Old Testament stories, but not solely, as I like to tell Hindu stories and Buddhist stories and stories of Muhammad as well. So I asked her if she'd like to hear one. All right, then, I told her, as I'm announcing to you now. Here is a wonderful little story that's actually a traditional Chinese folktale in which the Buddha plays a supporting role. So to set this story up, I'd like you to imagine a scene from the old TV series Kung Fu from back in the 70s, starring David Carradine. It was one of my favorites. And in this scene, imagine there's a headmaster, one of the elder monks of the Shaolin Temple, who is instructing a group of novices, student monks, who are sitting around the master in a semicircle out in the courtyard when he asked them if they'd like to hear a story. So he leans forward, clasps his hands beneath his chin, and begins, "Well then, young sirs, here is the story of the student and the monk. Many years ago, in a rural village in China, there lived a Buddhist monk who was the teacher in a village school, who, when you consider the traditional image of what a Buddhist monk should be, like ourselves, for example, this particular monk was not that. Because it turns out, you see, that he was quite fond of good food and drink, to the point that his belly had grown as big as that of the famous statue of the Laughing Buddha, who, by the way, is said to have also been a teacher. But quite apart from the enlightened state of the Laughing Buddha, this monk would fall fast asleep after consuming a big meal, or snacks as he preferred to call them, feigning all the time that he was deep in meditation on the all-seeing Buddha. So every day after an ample breakfast, he would arrive at the school. And every day after giving the lesson, he would have his snacks while the children worked in their books. And every day he would fall fast asleep until the bell sounded signaling the end of study. And every day this same routine would be repeated. He would fall fast asleep after consuming his snack, snoring peacefully until he was awakened by the bell at the end of study. Then one day a new student arrived at the school. His name was Lee. His family had recently moved to the village because his father was quite ill, and the village had a hospital where his father sought treatment. So Lee began to attend the school, and after a week or so of witnessing this odd behavior of the teacher, one day asked him, "Teacher, may I ask you why you sleep each day while we work in our books?" Which was quite an audacious question for that young man to ask, and had it been any other student, might well have resulted in a beating. But the monk, unabashed, only smiled, and without the slightest hint of anger or embarrassment, replied, "Dear boy, you are new here, and I thought by now the other children will have told you that it only appears that I sleep. And in fact, during those moments, I go to meet with the Buddha, where I listen to his wise words. That's why I try to sleep as much as I can, even here at school." Which was not an explanation that quite squared with Lee. But he knew, nevertheless, that it was not in his best interest to question the teacher about it further, so he left it at that, as did the other students. Well, then a few weeks later, Lee's father took a turn for the worse. And Lee, he stayed up all night one night helping his mother care for him, so that at school the next day he was so tired that after the lesson he could no longer keep his eyes open and soon fell fast asleep. Slept so deeply that he didn't hear the bell, which on cue woke up the teacher, who, when he saw the boy sleeping, grew so angry that he snatched Lee by the ear and screamed, "Aha! You little rascal," he bellowed, "I caught you. How dare you fall asleep in my class?" Poor Lee, startled and desperate, looked this way and that, when suddenly he had a flash of inspiration. "But teacher," he cried in his defense, "it only appeared that I slept, when all that whole time I was really with the Buddha, listening to his wise words." "Ah, indeed," scowled the incensed monk. "And just what did the all-seeing Buddha have to say to you?" "Well," the boy hesitated as a wry smile began to erupt across his face. "The all-seeing Buddha told me," he said, "that never in my life have I seen your teacher." And that's it.
Well, thank you very much for that story. I think I'm going to be real careful about ringing bells. So thank you for sharing that story, and we'll share some more information about their work in the thing I will send out to people later. We want to move now to Iran. Excuse me, I never pronounce this right. Iran Sharp in Port Angeles. Let me find you on the thing here. And okay, he's one of the storytellers of the story people of Clallam County. And I've always liked that name, the story people of Clallam County. Most people don't know where Clallam County is. It's actually on the north edge of the Olympic Peninsula, and it's alongside the Strait Juan de Fuca. And from looking across from Port Angeles, you can see the south edge of Vancouver Island in Victoria. And there's a ferry that runs from there across. So probably he's as close to our Canadian friends as any of us are. The story people of Clallam County had a storytelling festival, the Forest Festival, for what was it, 24 years?
26, I think.
26, and was a very popular festival. He's going to share a story for us as soon as I read his little introduction. He started out as a scientist for the National Park Service, then retrained as a therapist and never looked back. He's a licensed mental health counselor and nationally certified counselor in Washington State. He lives in Port Angeles with his wife and 2 children. The mountains, the rivers, and the oceans of the Pacific Northwest nourish his soul, as do meditation, drumming, dancing, and music. I don't think he's going to do all those things tonight, but he keeps very busy. He serves on the board of the Story People of Clallam County, is currently wearing 2 hats, though he took it off at the beginning of our gathering. One hat is that of secretary, and the other a treasurer. He also manages the sound system for their events, does advertising, and maintains their website. I know how things are for you. I've done that a lot for the Storytellers Guild here in Seattle. He's very excited to tell a favorite story tonight. It's called The Wizard and the Girl with Golden Hair.
All right. Thank you, Barry. And I would like to say that we are hopeful to have the Storytelling Festival start up again at some point. We're kind of low on volunteers after the COVID shutdown, but we are doing events in person. We have a monthly story swap. We are preparing for an annual Irish storytelling event in probably early April with Will Horniak. And we do host on Zoom Story Work the 3rd Monday evening of every month. And if you have a story that you want to get some feedback on, that's a place to come and practice. It's not a performance space, it's a workshop space on Zoom. We're also looking to host annual Liars Contest in July, probably July 9th, a couple days before the NSN conference in Seattle. And so we're trying to get geared back up for live storytelling. So yes, this story is a traditional folk tale from Norway. Long, long ago, when magic was still afoot in the world, but a time that was not all that different from our time. On the hill beside a small town, there lived a wizard. No one visited the mansion of this wizard other than the few servants who worked there. Folks in town, some said he was an evil wizard. Some said he was just lonely. But he lived in his opulent house, surrounded by gardens. And in the gardens, he had statues of young women, maidens, that were so lifelike that if you walked past them, you almost expected them to turn and speak to you. And indeed, each one of them had once been a living, breathing maiden who the wizard turned into a statue through his magic to keep him company. Now, one day, the wizard was walking in his garden, and he noticed that he had statues of girls with brown hair, statues of girls with black hair, statues of girls with red hair, but no statue of a girl with golden hair. He became obsessed with the need to have a statue of a golden-haired girl to make his collection complete, to make his life happy. And so he went back to his dressing room and prepared himself. He washed his face with milk to make it look innocent. He put honey on his lips to make his words sweet. He dressed in fine clothes to make himself look like a gentleman. And finally, he put on his magic cape that would allow him to fly and to wrap up the girl he wanted to bring back to turn into a statue. It would wrap her up if she set foot on it, and she must do so willingly. He could not force her. And so the wizard flew down towards the town, and he spied Elsa, a girl from the village, picking berries. The sun shone on her golden hair so bright they had almost blinded the wizard. He waited on the path just ahead of her, beside a muddy spot. And when Elsa came down the path, the wizard gallantly took his cloak and spread it over the mud in front of her, saying, "Dear girl, do not muddy your dainty feet. Here, let me help you." But Elsa walked around his cloak and said to him, "I am not a dear girl, and I am not dainty. You are a fool who has gotten mud all over his cloak." Oh, the wizard was furious. He picked up his cloak and flew on, looking for another opportunity to ensnare her. A little ways down the path, he saw a goat grazing off the side of the path. He had an idea. He spoke the words of a magic spell to bring a swarm of bees to harass and sting the goat all over. When the goat spied Elsa, it charged at her in its madness. The wizard stepped forward and told Elsa, "I will protect you." But Elsa ran away from the wizard around a tree, and the goat followed, chasing Elsa, and around the tree they went. The wizard maneuvered, trying to get his cloak under Elsa's foot, but she leaped and twisted and avoided the cloak. And instead of Elsa, the goat stepped on the cloak. The cloak wrapped itself up around the goat and the wizard and prepared to fly off. The wizard smacked the goat with his fist, knocking it out of the cloak, but the goat's horn tore a rip in the cloak. Elsa came over and said to him, "Oh, look, your beautiful cloak has gotten torn, and all because you are trying to protect me. Let me heal it, and let me fix it for you." And she took a few strands of golden hair and twisted them to make a thread. And with a thorn from a bush and another thorn piercing a hole, she made it into a needle and deftly sewed up the tear in the wizard's cloak. When she was done, she handed the cloak back to the wizard and said, "There, that should take care of it until you can get it properly mended." The wizard looked, admiring her handiwork, and then said to her, "Oh, but look here, you missed a spot." Elsa leaned in to see, and her foot stepped on a corner of the cloak. The cloak wrapped itself up around Elsa and the wizard, and they started to fly up into the air back to his castle But then they stopped. The stitches had snagged on a branch, and it would not go. The wizard tugged, but it wouldn't come free. He used both hands to grab and pull the cloak from the branch, and in so doing, Elsa squirmed out of his grasp, dropped down to the ground, and ran back to the village. The wizard finally managed to get his cloak free and flew back to his mansion in a foul mood. He entered the mansion and yelled and screamed at the servants. He kicked the dogs. He threw his plate against the wall and smashed it. And a little later went up to bed. As he lay in bed, he found that he couldn't sleep. The room was so bright. And so he got up to go to the window and close the shutters, thinking that the full moon was lighting his room. But he looked out, and the sky was cloudy, and there was no moon. He looked around the room for the source of the light, and he saw the golden stitches in the cloak were glowing bright. He took the cloak and threw it in his closet and shut the door and got into bed. But by the time he got into bed, the cloak was out of the closet and brightening the room even more intensely. He got up, grabbed the cloak, stormed down the stairs and down to the dungeon and locked the cloak in the dungeon. But by the time he came back up the stairs to his bed, the cloak was there in the room again. The wizard did not sleep a wink that whole night. The next day, he took the cloak and he flew down to the village, flew down to Elsa's house, knocked on the window. Elsa said, "Go away. My mother told me about men like you." The wizard said, I know, all I wish is for you to remove these stitches from my cloak. Elsa said, "I won't do it." The wizard promised her, "I will give you a farm and gold if you take these out." Elsa said, "I don't want a farm and gold." The wizard promised her, "I will give you a handsome prince to marry." Elsa said, "I don't want a handsome prince, and I don't want to get married." Wizard lost his temper and hollered, "Get over here right now, you miserable wretch, and take these stitches out." Elsa looked calmly at him and said, "I won't, and you can't make me." The wizard, furious again, flew off, muttering, "You'll be sorry." That night, again, he couldn't sleep. It was so bright. He took a knife and he cut out the section of cloak that had the stitches in it, threw that section out the window. But what do you know? Before he was back in bed, the piece was back in his cloak and the room was brilliantly lit, and he could not sleep a wink that night either. The next day, he was all alone. The servants had deserted the place. The dogs and cats had taken off. Even the rats from the dungeon had left. He was walking in the garden, talking to the statues, which were his only company. And he said to himself, "That girl, she doesn't know how powerful I am and who she's dealing with." And he got an idea. And he turned one of the statues back into a living maiden and instructed her to go down to the village and to tell Elsa who he was, what a powerful wizard he was. And off she scampered. Now that night, the stitches dimmed just a little bit, just enough for an hour that the wizard was able to get a bit of sleep. And the next day, he flew down to the village once again to Elsa's house. And he asked her, "Did you have a visitor yesterday?" Elsa said yes, she had. The wizard told her, Well, so now you know what a powerful wizard I am, don't you? Elsa said, yes, I do. And did you sleep a little last night? The wizard was taken aback. How did you know? Yes, I did. Elsa said, now you know what a powerful witch I am. And now you know what you have to do if you ever want to sleep again, don't you? The wizard, defeated, gave a small nod. He flew back to his mansion. He turned all of the statues back into living maidens and sent them off. And the stitches in the cloak always retained a faint glow as a warning and a reminder as to what would happen if he ever used his magic powers for such selfish purposes again.
Well, that's quite a story. I've never heard that one. It's always nice to know that a wizard gets his just desserts. And that was quite an interesting story. Where did you find that?
I originally heard it from the telling of Dan Keating, and also found a version of it in a collection of Norwegian stories that I have on my shelf. I couldn't give you the exact citation, but yeah.
I've got a few of those in my shelf too. I'll have to look and see. Thank you very much. Our next teller, though, is off on Vancouver Island. Vancouver Island sits up to the north of us a little ways from where I'm at. It's a beautiful place. Victoria is a great place to visit if you're ever in the area. It's a really nice town to see the sights. They've got great museums and other things there, and a wonderful botanical garden. But to get there, you have to take a ferry, either from Port Angeles or over to Nanaimo, and Washington State ferries are not really running that way at the moment. But anyway, our teller tonight lives in Nanaimo, I assume. She's part of the Around Town Tellers. And Rachel is quite the storyteller. If you visit her website, you'll find that she's got a lot of interesting things there, stories that she's told and other things. Let me share a little bit about her. She was born in California, but she grew up and still lives on Vancouver Island and is a teller of the Round Town Storytellers in Nanaimo. She's a storyteller, a podcaster, a magazine editor, and the author of 4 children's novels and countless articles and stories for adults. More information to her on her podcast and so on will be sent to you, and a couple of her collections, Hinter Tales and Sticks and Stones and Stories, are on her website. She's telling a true Northwest story tonight called Trouble on Triple Island. Observe her background. Her primary source for this true story is the book Lights of the Inside Passage by the late Donald Graham, a lighthouse keeper on BC's coast for many years. Rachel, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Barry. And thank you for inviting me and for inviting us to gather in this way. This is very special. And that is one of the gifts of COVID, that we are able to do this. So as Barry said, I am a member of Nanaimo's Around Town Tellers, which is one of 3 storytelling groups on Vancouver Island. We just celebrated our 17th anniversary. We are gathering in person again since COVID. We gather once a month on the second Friday of each month from September through June. And you can join us, because while we gather in person, we also have our events broadcast on Zoom. So you can find out more on our website about that. One of our founders, Margaret Murphy, who is on this call with us, will be co-hosting a storytelling workshop with Pat Forrest in just a few weeks on February 2nd and 3rd. And that's an annual thing that we do. And 2 years ago, we co-hosted the Storytellers of Canada Contour du Canada conference along with Mid-Island Storytellers, and that was very much the work of Marva Blackmore, past president of Storytellers of Canada, and she is also on this call. So hello to Margaret and Marva, and hello to all of you. So for my story this evening, as Barry has already introduced, we are traveling to a tiny island off the north coast of British Columbia. An island so tiny, in fact, that when the tide is high, it becomes 3 separate rocks, which is why it's known as Triple Island. Now, as we begin, I'm going to invite you to close your eyes for just a moment and imagine, if you can, what the weather must be like on a winter night like this one. Can you feel the wind? Can you taste the salt on your lips? When the waves rise, there's only one place to take shelter. In the lighthouse that was built on the largest rock back in 1920 to safeguard the ships sailing past on their way to Prince Rupert. Well, Tom and Sophie Moran moved into that lighthouse in November of 1929, along with their 2-month-old son, so that Tom could become the lighthouse's lightkeeper. Now, it was not an easy post, as you can imagine, but then Tom was no stranger to the challenges of lightkeeping. He'd spent his adolescence with his family on Green Island, which is just a few miles south of the Alaska border. So he knew all about isolation and meager pay, about winter storms and unpredictable supply ships, and what it's like to sleep above a foghorn that's meant to be heard for 40 miles. Not that lightkeepers do much sleeping on foggy nights. Sophie Moran, on the other hand, was new to this life, but she was up for the challenge, and she understood that if they were going to make it on Triple Island, she would have to work side by side with her husband. Which is why, one blustery November morning, just a few weeks after they'd arrived, while their son was asleep, Sophie was at the controls in the winch shed, while Tom worked down on the rocks below, preparing a load of wood to be hoisted up to the lighthouse. Now, the winch is a very dangerous machine with a powerful engine and all kinds of unguarded moving parts. Now, normally Sophie was careful to wear overalls when she operated the winch, but on this particular morning, for whatever reason, she was not wearing overalls. And as she was working, she got a little too close to the flywheel. In an instant, it grabbed hold of the hem of her dress, wrenched her off her feet, and dragged her into the gears. Well, Tom raced up to shut off the engine the moment he heard Sophie's screams, but it was too late. He had to cut away her clothing to get her free from the gears, and when he did, he was horrified. Sophie was in rough shape, in really rough shape. And since BC's lighthouses were ridiculously underfunded in 1929, they did not have a two-way radio to call for help, although they did exist. They had no painkillers, no antiseptic, no bandages. Tom could only bind his wife's wounds in strips cut from their bed sheets, which he soaked in diluted Lysol. And he tended his wife, cared for their young son, and prayed that the supply ship would show up soon. Well, a full week later, in the middle of a heavy gale, the SS Alberni finally arrived and anchored a safe distance off the rocks while a smaller boat was launched. The men had to carry Sophie down on a stretcher and then wade through icy chest-high water to get her safely into the boat. And when they finally reached the ship, they put her in a makeshift shelter out on the deck. As brutal as the weather was, Sophie had already lost so much blood that they couldn't afford to maneuver her broken body through the narrow passages below decks. That simply was not an option. To make matters worse, Tom could not accompany his wife back to Prince Rupert. He had to remain behind to tend the lighthouse while also watching their young son. But the captain of the Alberni promised that he would get word back to Tom within 24 hours through the commercial radio station in Prince Rupert. You see, while the lighthouse did not have a two-way radio to call for help, it did have a cabinet radio to listen to the news and other shows. Well, as you can imagine, for the next 24 hours, Tom is glued to that radio. But though he listens every second, there is no word of his wife. What he doesn't know is that the storm has delayed the Alberni in its return to Prince Rupert, forcing it to anchor overnight in a nearby fish camp. What Tom does know, that after 24 sleepless hours, if he doesn't find out what happened to Sophie, if she has even survived, he is going to lose his mind. So even though the seas are still churning, he lowers his own tiny rowboat into the water, jury-rigs a mast and a sail, carefully stows his 2-month-old son in the bow of that boat, and sets sail. Tom's plan is to use a light from one of the other stations as his bearing on his way back to Prince Rupert, a full 28 nautical miles away. But Tom's tiny vessel is quickly swept miles off course, and so he has to make a new plan. He'll head up to Green Island instead. Now let me repeat that. Tom is in an open rowboat on BC's north coast in the middle of a November storm with his 2-month-old baby stowed in the bow of the boat, making his way to a tiny island another 20 miles to the north. Well, somehow, many hours after setting out, Tom and his son both arrived safely on Green Island, where his parents are still the lightkeepers. And no sooner has he turned over his son to his mother's care than he is able to hail a passing fish packer on its way to Prince Rupert. And when he reaches the hospital, he finds Sophie alive and now in stable condition. Well, it probably shouldn't come as a surprise that although all 3 family members are eventually able to reunite back on Triple Island, Tom and Sophie apply for a new position as soon as they can. But they don't quit. Despite the nightmare that they've just lived through, they will go on to serve another 20 years in lighthouses along the coast. And as for Triple Island, or Little Alcatraz as it's sometimes known, well, it's not quite the same light station that it used to be. These days, 2 lightkeepers at a time are helicoptered in to work 28-day shifts, and they have all the high-tech safety equipment and 21st century conveniences that they could want. But while the lighthouse has changed, the sea hasn't. And every once in a while, it will send a reminder of its strength. There was the log that came through a 3rd-story window during a particularly violent storm, or the wave that came through another window during another storm, sweeping the television that the lightkeeper was watching across the room and right onto his lap. more tragically, there was the rogue wave that swept a Coast Guard mechanic off the rocks in 1978, and he was never seen again. These are just a few reminders that the sea is and always will be worthy of our respect, as are the lightkeepers on both sides of our border who work every day, risk their lives every day to keep others safe. Thank you.
Wow, what a story. Yeah, Washington State, Vancouver Island, we have coastlines, water all over, the salt water of all sorts, and it can really get rambunctious in the wintertime. We just went through a spell a couple of weeks ago with extremely high tides and extremely high waves on the coast. Certainly, stories like this are a reminder of how fierce the weather can get. And we just had ourselves a good bout. How much snow do you have there, Rachel?
So we got, I think, about 10 centimeters. I'm just south of Nanaimo in a little town called Ladysmith.
Yeah, you're on the
so 10
east
to
side.
20 centimeters. So convert that to inches, about a foot.
It sounds about right.
Yeah.
I know Abigail said she had 10 inches up there in Vancouver. We were fortunate here. We had 16-degree temperatures and it rained.
Okay.
So we got lots of black ice.
Yes.
But not too much snow. I mean, it came down and just froze. It was fun, but it's finally started warming up after a week. Well, thank you very much for sharing about around town and the other work that's going on up there on Vancouver Island. Look forward. I hope people will visit your website because it's got a lot of really great stuff on it.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you.
Next, we're going to have a teller from the other side of the Cascade Mountains. Marty Falshore is actually a member of our board of the Seattle Storytellers Guild. She's kind of a remote member of the board because we meet on Zoom, and we've come to realize that we can actually have board members that don't live close by. Marty has contributed a great deal to us in the last several years in that, and she's really got into storytelling. So she's trying to organize a storytelling programs there in Ellensburg, which is located on the east slope of the Cascades coming down off of Stevens Pass. And growing up, she never told a lie in her life. She insists that's true, and I'm not too sure. But anyway, she went out of her way to do and approve something so that she could say that she did that, rather than the unapproved something she really did, but she won't tell us what it is. Anyway, now in retirement, she revels in telling tall tales, as well as folk tales, fairy tales, and whatever else she can think of. And boy, she can think of some doozies. Tonight, she's going to tell a story called Cabin on the Pacific. Marty, it's all yours.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you for putting all this together. It's pretty amazing. And yeah, I've started an in-person group here in Ellensburg, and it's very small. And if we don't start getting more people, I'm just going to have people over at my house. Right now, it's at our community center, and it's free because the library lets free community events happen for free. So we also have a contra dance if you want to come contra dance for Saturdays. That one's going on much better. I also have a little liars group that meets on fourth Mondays, and that's totally on Zoom, and Barry's gonna provide all that information in my email. So if you want to join us, you can, and they don't have to be tall tales. It can probably be anything you're working on. And that's kind of how our little Ellensburg group goes as well, is it can be stuff you're working on or just anything. We've had some really nice stories. So tonight, I'm going to the west side tonight. This story happened years ago, a few years ago, when I was finishing up a novel I was working on, and I was under a lot of pressure from my agent and my publisher and my editor to get the freaking thing done. It was this close, and I just needed to finish it. Plus, my husband Dale and I were just retired, and both of us at home all the time. It was kind of tough. And I couldn't get anything done at home. I'd get down the rabbit holes on the internet, or I'd start working on house projects. The book was aside, and there was all this pressure. So I decided I'm going to go to the ocean, get away from all of this, including Dale and the cats, get away from all of it, finish the book. And I gave myself 3 months. I got online. I found a perfect little 2-bedroom cabin right on the water, just beautiful. So I packed up the car, bought some groceries, drove out to the cabin following my GPS, and it had me going west. That was good. But then it put me on the beach, and it wanted me to keep going west. I wasn't going to do that. I'm not one of those people who does whatever the GPS tells me to do without thinking about what it's telling me to do. So I went back into town and started asking people about this address, which was 47 North, 256 West Pacific. And everybody told me there was no street called Pacific in their little town. I finally found a police officer who was like, oh yeah, I know where that is. Follow me. And she got in her car and I got back in my car and we drove onto the beach, which by the way, you're allowed to drive on the beach. Don't even get me started. Drove on the beach, parked. It was low tide, so we were pretty far out on the beach. And the police officer said, just look out on the water. Get your binoculars. And I have binoculars. I'm a birder. I always have binoculars. Got my binoculars and I looked, and there was my cabin on the Pacific. And the police officer said, that's your place. And I remembered the landlady had told me a couple of things about it. One, it's got spotty internet. That was good. I wouldn't go down that rabbit hole. It's got spotty cell. Okay, I can't call anybody. She will bring fresh water every 2 weeks and fill the cistern. And it's totally off the grid, total solar. And as I'm going to the house, I need to walk straight to the front steps. Don't waver, go straight to the front steps. So I was like, okay, I obviously have to walk through the water. So I put on my water shoes and pull up my pants. And I start and grab a couple of bags and I start walking to the house. About halfway there, I realize my feet are getting a little wet, but nothing else is. So I stopped and looked down, and I was about 2 feet above the bottom of the ocean. I was walking on the water to my house on the Pacific. I sort of took a breath and I kept walking, kind of sloshing, got in, put in my coat, went inside, and it was perfect. Had this wraparound porch, which I expected, a small living room, kitchen, hallway, bathroom, small bedroom on the left and a small one on the right. And I made one of them my office where I would do my work, and the other one my bedroom. Fully furnished house. It was just beautiful. So I made several trips to the car, bringing all my stuff into the house, parked the car in town off the beach, and spent the first 2 or 3 days watching the world go by. Because I don't know if you've ever been in the middle of the Pacific in a cabin, but it's amazing. All the wildlife, dolphins and the whales and the seals and all the fish and the birds. Oh my God, being a birder, it was amazing. Even though I'm not very good at identifying gulls and stuff like that, I wasn't getting anything done except walking around the house, literally walking around the house on the deck or on the water, going into town, taking walks on the beach and so on. And I realized I have to hit a schedule. So I made myself a schedule where I had to write 4 to 6 hours a day. I could go into town if I needed to. There was some little research I needed to continue. But for the most part, I was home writing or getting some exercise. And this was what was amazing. I'm in my extremely late 60s, as Garrison Keillor put it, extremely late 60s. And yet there were weights there. I could curl 20 pounds without a problem. I could bench press 100 pounds without a problem. I could actually run on the beach, and I'm not a runner. I could swim really well. It was, and all my aches and pains from being in my very late 60s, gone. It was truly a healing location. And I would go sit on the west porch and watch the storms come in. And most of us know what those Pacific storms are like. And they would just blow in and they'd be all around me and nothing on me in my little house. Plus, I went trying to figure out about this walking and what was holding up the house. And it turns out the walkways are about 3 or 4 feet wide. If you get off a walkway, you fall into the water. And I got my snorkel gear and went to try to figure out what was holding the house in place. Near as I could tell, the only thing holding it in place was the walkways. So I finished my novel, sent it off. I had 2 weeks left in the place, so I decided to invite Dale, my husband, to come visit me. So he came over and I tried to explain to him that when he gets there, he has to walk straight to the house, straight to the stairs to the house. But I also decided to wait for him on the beach. So I'm reading, sitting in my chair reading, and he walks right past me, looks at me, walks right past. And then he comes back, looks at me, sees me, walks right past. I'm like, Dale, it's me. Hello. And he looks at me and he says, did you dye your hair? It's like, no, I hadn't looked at myself. There weren't any mirrors in the cabin and I never look at myself anyway, hardly ever. And I said, no, I would never dye my hair. And he said, it's black. And I kind of, tried to look at it, but I couldn't. And apparently I didn't have any wrinkles anymore. And I was thin. And he and I kind of looked at each other and I led him into the house and we were on each other like rabbits. It was like we were 20 years old again. And we rekindled a lot of our relationship. Turns out my book got published. I won a Pulitzer for it. And Dale and I go back to that cabin on the Pacific every year to rekindle our relationship. And if you want to go to the cabin on the Pacific, just go to cabinonthepacific.com and make your reservation, but make it really early because they get booked out pretty far. Thank you.
Okay, there I go. Trying to find the mute button. Well, now you know the kind of true stories we get from Marty all the time. He gets you going, and pretty soon you're kind of starting to scratch your head a little bit. But we know that she tells us nothing but the unvarnished truth. And that,
it's
but if you
true.
want to get together with her on one Monday a month, they get together on Zoom and they share stories, and they especially like them stories that are too good to be true. And this obviously was a great one. I mean, that sounds like a great cabin.
It was awesome.
And I tell you,
Find the book. Good luck
and a
finding it.
Pulitzer to boot. Golly Shazam. Well, thank you, Marty. We appreciate that, and I look forward to seeing you at our next board meeting. We're never bored when Marty's around, that's for sure. Our final teller tonight is actually going to take us down to Oregon. And let me find you here. There you are. Mike Devaney is part of the Portland Storytellers Guild. Portland is actually pretty close to us. We've had a lot of interaction between them. And, when I first got involved in the guild, I couldn't really tell the difference between the Portland people and the Seattle people because they connected quite a bit. And we got a lot of friends down there in Portland. They have a lot of friends up here. Mike in particular is an Irish Catholic fellow. And so storytelling for him is kind of a generic trait. Depending on how you look at it, it's good or bad, I assume. But a teacher most of his life for 11 years, he taught values and ethics in a college level. And then he spent 30 years teaching in middle school and high school. So he's definitely a teacher. He got an award in 1997 by the Council for Spiritual and Ethical Education as National Teacher of the Year. And they noted in the award he had a creative use of story in helping students see themselves as agents of positive change. He's also made presentations on the value of using stories in the classroom at several regional and national teaching conventions. And after retiring in 2018, he got involved with the Portland Storytellers Guild and has served on its board for the last 4 years. He's also a jock. And if you wonder what that's all about, you got to listen to the story because he'll explain it. But his story is, in contrast to the last story, truth and whole truth.
Yeah, great setup for you. Just to introduce you to the Portland Guild, Storytellers Guild, I'm hearing about swaps, I'm hearing about shows, and ours are just month after month after month. It's a great schedule. We do story swaps the second Saturday of every month. We have shows once a month, and it just goes on and on. But I want to just tell you a story about them, and you'll know what it's like to be with Portland Storytellers Guild. We have our shows at a place called the Artichoke Cafe. Small little place. About a third of it is a store with music instruments. Then a third of it is a place to get them to allow them to practice and things like that and learn. And then there's a small theater. Well, somebody broke into it and they did thousands of dollars of damage, and they stole all sorts of instruments and things like that, sound stuff. It was just awful. And within 4 days, the Portland Storytellers Guild had put together a show and had that show on, 3 days later, and raised over $1,000 for the Artichoke. And what I really liked about it is they're a nonprofit organization and we're a nonprofit organization, and we got a chance to help them. My story is called Truth and the Whole Truth. When I was a kid, I really enjoyed watching Perry Mason, particularly when he was in the courtroom and he'd have the witnesses raise their hand and swear to tell the truth, but also swear to tell the whole truth. And I'm going to do that with you tonight. When I was in high school, I want to get this for you first. When I was in high school, I participated in 5 varsity sports. Over the 4 years of high school, I earned 18 different letters. Now, that's the truth. But here's the whole truth. During those 4 years, I was an atrocious student. I took Algebra 1 twice. I had a D- in Spanish. And because it was a Catholic school, I had to learn Latin. And I literally passed Latin on the final. I had to get a 75, and I got a 76. But I have a feeling that that teacher just showed a little bit of benignatus, which is Latin for kindness, or maybe spaghetti, one or the other. Well, after high school, I went on to college, a small college in Indiana, and I played on the tennis team. The biggest thing was I actually dedicated myself to becoming a student. And I realized that I couldn't play in all these sports. So it was just tennis, books, and a little bit of social work. So that worked out just fine. A couple years later, I got back into doing different sports, particularly endurance sports. Now, 100-mile bike rides, marathon runs, things like that. But when I discovered triathlons, I fell in love with it. Now, you might not know what a triathlon is, so let me define it for you. Triathlon: swim, bike, run, collapse. And I was pretty good at it. As a matter of fact, early on, I actually qualified for the Hawaii Ironman race. Now, I'll tell you how that happened, and this is all true. The qualifying race was up in Sumner, Washington, and it goes by age groups. Every 5 years, you change your age group. Well, I got there, and you had to finish at least third to qualify for Hawaii. I did my level best, and I finished 8th. But here's the whole truth. As it turns out, the guys who finished first and second had already qualified for Hawaii. So that moved me up to 6th. And then it turns out that the race officials were penalizing the 3 guys in front of me for working together on the bike ride. You're supposed to be independent, and they were kind of drafting, I guess. And their penalties were enough that I went from 6th to 5th to 4th to 3rd. And I qualified for the World Championships. Now, for the most part, I did a lot of triathlons, dozens of them, and I got into running, road running, things like that. But I was kind of a middle of the pack kind of guy. Occasionally, I'd finish in the top 10, or maybe I'd get a 3rd place at some smaller race or something like that. That's the truth. But here's the whole truth. In doing all that, I got to know a lot of people around what they were doing, and I just kept pushing at it and keeping going, and realized that a lot of people that I used to run with and bike with weren't doing that anymore. So when I turned 70, everything changed. I moved up to a new age group, 70 to 74. Now, I'm 71 now. And a year ago, starting a year ago to now, I've done 5 events. And this is true, 5 events. And in those 5 events, some of them running, some of them triathlon, I've gotten 2 first-place finishes, 2 second-place finishes, and a 3rd-place finish. From my point of view, I'm a superstar. But then there's the whole truth. that first place that I got was at a triathlon. And the reason I finished first place in my age group was that I was the only one there in my age group. The other first place I got was our run. I had gone back to my home in Richmond, Virginia for a high school reunion, and I decided to do the Henrico 5K. It's a small little county race. And I won it. And I won it the same way I won that triathlon. I was the only guy in my age group, so I finished first. Now, as for the second place finishes, here in Portland, as I'm sure you know, that there's the Nike facility. The Nike World Campus is right in this area. And there's a club called the Bowerman Track Club. It's one of the fastest in the country. They sponsor a race, but the great part about it is they don't run in it. So I went to the campus, and that's where the race was, and it was a fundraiser, so this was really going to be fun. And I didn't know anybody or what was going on, but off we went on the run. As it worked out, it turned out there were 5 people in my age group. The first guy was a national champion last year. He's from Seattle. Then the other people that were there were the two guys that were running, and they looked to me like they were pretty good just walking around. But I didn't really see much of them on the course. And then there was a guy who, I looked at him and I went, this could be interesting. This guy's, he was round. And everybody else here was swimming, all that kind of stuff. Well, the guy who won the nationals last year, he won. I finished second. And I went, wait a minute, here? It turned out that the other 2 guys that I was talking about, one of them ran, here's the whole story, one of them ran with his grandson. And the other one ran with his 50-year-old daughter who had just recovered from cancer. So neither of those guys were running as fast as they could. And the guy that I thought was a little iffy, he didn't run a 5K, he ran a 3K, and then he walked the rest. The second place where I got a second place finished was actually a pretty big triathlon. And it was a qualifier for the national championships. Now, I had a chance to get to meet all these guys, and we were talking back and forth. Well, Phil Anderson was there. Phil Anderson wins everything, and he's beaten me 1,000 times. So I knew I wasn't going to get first, but I really, really wanted to get that second place finish. Well, there were 2 guys who, this was their first triathlon. One of them had a 45-pound mountain bike with a bell on the handlebars. And the other guy confessed that he actually had never done any kind of swimming on a lake. This would be his first time in the race. So I didn't worry too much about those 2. But then there were 3 other guys, and I call them the 3 amigos. I've raced with them for years, and sometimes, I beat all 3 of them, or I finished 4th. It varied through the years. But here we were. So we all were looking for that second place finish. The race takes off, and we're just going. And just like before, the 4 of us all get out of the water at the same time. Then I got a big lead in the bike, and then they would always catch up to me in the run. But they didn't catch up. So I got second place. Now here's the whole story. The reason I got second place was the 3 of them had a bike crash at the bottom of a hill. So they DNF'd, did not finish. And that's how I qualified for the national championships. Now, that third place that I was talking about earlier, that was the Beaverton 5K. I didn't know anybody. There wasn't anybody who got hurt. There were no accidents. It was just a nice, fun run, and I finished third. It was great. Over this past year, there's two things that I have learned. Half of life is showing up. And the second thing I've learned is there's something to be said for a guy who's not dead. And that's the whole truth. Thank you.
Oh, such an encouragement you are to us old folks. Well, I guess that's the truth, the whole truth.
Yeah.
Appreciate that very much. Thank you, Mike, for sharing a little bit of that. As I mentioned, I'm going to be sending out probably in a day or so a document gives all this information on different guilds and websites. It'll also have the email addresses for the tellers if you want to send them a personal word of thanks. But for the moment, feel free to unmute, and I'm going to switch to the gallery view, and I'll give you a few minutes to respond to the storytellers and chat a little bit. I'm going to stop the recording at this time so that I can get to it. Okay, there we go. So that you don't have to feel worried about what you say being recorded. And so, well, I hope people are finding their way back to their places. I put up a few announcements on the screen there. I did mention our purple hat. We used to pass the purple hat around at our live events for people to make donations. I know some of our guilds have tickets for events. Others have donations, but all of us know that we need to support our storytellers, and we are supporting our storytellers tonight as a guild, the Seattle Storytellers Guild. But we do welcome your donations, and we do encourage you, if you attend other storytelling events, to make donations as well to any of these events that we mentioned by these various tellers and so on. It does cost money to run a guild, and tellers deserve to be well supported. And on top of that, just think, if you'd gone out to the movie, you would have to spend money for parking, you would have to purchase a ticket, you would probably go out to eat afterwards. But here you get to stay at home, you can raid the fridge, a lot less expensive. You don't have to find a parking place and deal with all that, but you get some really excellent entertainment. And I know that it's very important to pay tellers what they're worth to you. So do think about making donations when you attend these Zoom events as well as live events. It's one of the things that keeps us guilds going.